Hello guys, welcome to lesson 1 of our module 7, creating GitHub repository. And here we are going to look at the remote Git repository, which is usually known as GitHub and which is usually used on the real world scenarios. You will probably use GitHub when you're working on a real world project so that you can be able to work remotely with several developers. And so without further ado, let us dive in and see how we can be able to create remote repositories in GitHub and also how we can be able to interact with GitHub repository. All right. So I just open my browser here. As you can see, okay, you need to go to github.com and open a new GitHub account. All right, github.com and open a new GitHub account. And once you have opened an account, it's very easy. Just enter your email, your name, and you'll be able to sign up for this account. And once you have signed up, you can add a profile picture like this one that I've added here. And this is how the initial page will look once you have created the account. And so what we're going to look here, let us see how to create a repository, how to interact or push or pull from the repository, and that I believe will be enough on how to learn to interact with this remote GitHub repository. So to create a remote GitHub repository, you will come to this on your upper right corner. You'll click on this plus icon here and then click on new repository. So now what we are basically doing is that we are initializing a new repository remotely, and then we can be able to link this remote repository with our local repository so that we can be able to push code and pull code from these two repositories. All right, so here I'm just going to name this as test. Okay, let us test is okay. For description, I'm going to just say test repository. And then here you can choose between these two options, either to make this repository public or private. And for now, just make this repository to be public, and private is a much more advanced feature. So I'll cover that in another course. And then it's always a good option to initialize your remote with a README file so that you can be able to provide more metadata, more information about your repository. All right, so when people are cloning from your repository, they can be able to clearly understand what your repository is storing and what basically your repository is about. So I'm going to check this option here. For now, you don't need to understand about the git ignore file, but basically the git ignore file is used to, if you have maybe a couple of folders or a couple of files that you will want or wish not to be included in your final GitHub repository or in your remote repository, then you'll add this git ignore file and list all those files and folders here. So choose a license. This is now not that important, and then I just click create repository. All right, so this will initialize a remote repository, and in a minute we ought to have our remote repository. All right, so once the initialization has been done, it will land you to a page like this. All right, in a page like this, where we have here main. This lists the branches that are in the repository, and by default the remote repository will come with the branch main. All right, and then here you'll be able to list the files. Since we included by default the readme file, that is what you're seeing here with the name test and with this small description here, test description. So that is enough for now. So now let us go back to our local repository, and what I'm going to do, let me just create a new file here, a new folder, sorry. I'll name this folder test. So inside this test folder, let me just open this. I'm going to do what? I'm going to open this in CMD. Then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to initialize git repository here, git init, like this. So once I've done that, I'm going to connect this local repository with the remote repository. And to do that is quite simple. You'll go to the remote repository and then click on this option of code here. And then it will give you three options: HTTPS, SSH, and GitHub CLI. So for now, for beginners, HTTPS is always the best SSH is maybe if you want some level of security, and this is a much more advanced feature, also GitHub CLI. So let us look at HTTPS. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on this option here, and this will copy this link, all right, this link to the remote repository. Then I'll go back to my CMD, and then what I'm going to do here is very simple. I'm going to say git remote add. So I'm saying git remote add. I'm going to add a git remote repository, and then here I can provide the name for the repository or for the remote repository. In this case, I'll just say test, and then I'll paste the link for the remote repository, and then enter. So what this will do is that it will add that repository to my local repository. So now if I say git remote, this is a function to list, or this is a feature, is a command to list the remote repository that you have added in your local repository. So if I press enter, you can see that now we have a remote repository added by the name test. And then now, since now I've been able to link these two repository, I can be able now to push, to clone everything that you ought to do or you need to do. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a file here. Let's call this file, let me just say type null first, and let's call this file test34.txt like this. And then now if I list the files here, you should be able to see test34 here. So what I'm going to do, if I say git status, this file hasn't been added, neither has this file been staged or committed. So as you can see here, you can see untracked changes. So I'm going to say git add, and I'm going to add everything using the -a flag. And then I'm going to git commit this guy. Very simple. -m, then I'm going to say added a test file. All right. So the file has been committed, and if I say git log, you should be able to see this file appears. All right. As you can see, we have this this commit here with the specific changes that we added. So the next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to push these changes to my remote git repository, and to do that I'm going to say git push, and the name git push, then the name of the repository, which is test, and then the branch that we want this file to go. In this case, we want these changes to go to the branch masters. So we have git push test masters, and then I'll just press enter. So this will take a couple of minutes or just a couple of seconds, and then we'll be able to have our file remotely. All right. So it is pushing, and the file has been pushed. All right. So now if I go back to my remote repository and just do a refresh, I ought to see, or I need to see, the file that I've just added. As you can see now, if I click on this list of branches, we should be able to have two branches. Why? Because I've committed the branch, or rather I've created the branch master, which is here. And if I click here, we need to have our file, which is test34. All right. And of course it is here. So the same thing we can be able to pull again. Let us assume now, let me just add a change here. Let me do this and say add file. So I'm going just to add a file remotely, and then we're gonna try to pull this file and see if we can be able to get the changes. So the scenario that I'm trying to replicate here is that, let me just add this and say ret.txt. This is just a dummy file, and then I'll scroll down and then commit these changes. So the scenario that I'm trying to replicate here is a scenario whereby your colleague maybe is working remotely and has pushed his changes to this remote server or to this remote repository, and now on your side, now you need to update or pull these changes from the remote repository so that you can have these updated changes. So here what I'm going to do, in my local repository, I can just now git pull. All right, and this will pull the changes from the remote. Okay, git pull origin, git pull, then the name of the repository, and then the branch. I want to pull from master. So this will pull the changes from the remote repository to your local repository. All right. And now if I list the file, as you can see, I have the file ret.txt. So that is how you can be able to create a remote Git repository. You can be able to push to this remote repository. You can be able to pull from this remote repository, and even much interesting, you can be able to clone. Remember all the things that we've been doing with the local remote repository. You can be able to perform all these changes with this remote repository. And so guys, that brings us to the end of this lesson. I hope you have been able to learn how to create remote Git repository, how to be able to perform the pull and pushes changes, and just play around and get better acquainted with this remote repository, and then you'll be ready for our next lesson. Thank you and bye bye.